Bloodborne is known as a golden baby in the Souls community, and it's one of the most beloved games ever made. People adore this game. They buy PlayStations for this game, and they feel a great sense of joy when slaughtering the beasts and bosses of Yharnam. This game was the birth of consistent quality bosses to look forward to. A lot of bosses in this game still hold up to this day, and FromSoft has continued to iterate upon that idea as the bosses almost always get better and better with each new release. However, Bloodborne is not Dark Souls 3, and the biggest strength of this game is not the bosses. It's the trick weapons and aesthetic that people gush over, not always the bosses. But do not let that fool you. Bloodborne still has a handful of fun and gripping bosses, and if you read the title or you've been following along with this video series, this is a review of every single Soulsborne boss, and we are finally at the point where bosses are really freaking good. So if they're so good, let's get to it. The Cleric Beast is our first boss in Bloodborne, and there's an immediate shift with how Bloodborne handles its bosses. The telegraphed swipes and grabs are still present, but the game's speed has been increased for both the player and enemy AI. This is something that has never really gone away, as the slow, weighty, and methodical playstyles have been less and less common with each new release. Even Dark Souls 2 was a step up in overall combat quality and speed when compared to Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1. The increase in speed isn't the only difference, but I find the overall pace to be more preferable, especially in Bloodborne. Bloodborne is the only Souls game where I roleplay in, as I like the idea of being a hunter wandering the dark and moody streets of Yharnam and slaughtering everything that stands in my way. Bloodborne really went for that immersive feel, and it does have a special sauce that the mainline Souls games, including Elden Ring, simply do not have for me. How the immersion transitions over to combat isn't just the speed, although the speed is a large part of it. I am a hunter, and I should know what I'm doing, but it's also the rally system that From Software introduced here. Rally has to be the saddest mechanic that has been left on the table, as the whole game can be designed around the idea of trading and all-out aggression. Bosses in Bloodborne can really lean into that idea of being an unfathomable beast, a sick and grotesque monster that will force you to master its mechanics and use Rally Heal to its full potential. They can hit harder and have longer attacks and not feel like a lopsided mess with the amount of healing you will end up doing. The Old Hunters DLC really understood this, as the bosses turn up the aggression and damage to an even higher notch than what the base game attempted. Although the speed and the alteration to combat is not the only difference here. This game's original soundtrack was taken to the next level. I can only assume that we had such a bump in music quality because this was a project with the Sony name glued onto it. Sony most likely had more faith in Bloodborne after the success of Dark Souls 1. They had zero faith in Demon Souls, so luckily their faith was properly placed, and in return, we got some of the best music and content From Software has ever produced. Mechanically, the first boss to a Souls game has a lot riding on it. This game is such a deviation from the norm that even experienced Souls players at the time probably weren't able to walk into this boss room and create an artistic bloodbath. I think that the first boss you can experience in Bloodborne was properly placed. Cleric Beast is optional, but he's a boss that helps you foster skills to take into Gascoine if you simply cannot beat him. Gascoine will turn into a beast enemy in his second phase, giving you experience with a beast type enemy, as you have to have a few different combat variations in your brain, since Bloodborne mainly has beast enemies, cosmic enemies, and hunter enemies to fight. Beast enemies will usually move faster and in a more unpredictable manner, making moveset memorization more important. While hunter fights, you can rely on the animation to simply make sense and dodge instinctively based on what is being thrown at you. Cleric Beast obviously gets a lot right, but most of the criticism that is thrown at this guy is of course the camera. I have thought a lot about the camera as I've played through these games, and all of these games have issues with the camera. The thing with a poor camera is that the longer the games go on, the less excusable it becomes. Cleric Beast having a poor camera is a flaw FromSoft clearly knew about, but they didn't have the time to fix it, or they simply didn't know how. I can forgive camera issues in Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3 is starting to push it, and Elden Ring should be criticized the most for having camera issues. The poor camera really may be the saddest issue with this boss, as the model of Cleric Beast is really cool and well done, but you usually only see the lower half for most of the fight. My summation of the Cleric Beast is that his weaknesses are outweighed by his strengths. He's a very hard boss for a new player, but he also makes Gascoine easier since you at least learn the patterns and tales for beast-type enemies and whatever souls you rack up killing this guy. For the longest time, Father Gascoine was the best early game boss From Software had ever made. He was a golden nugget that could be framed as what an early game boss should be. I could compare him to Margit and Elden Ring, as these two parallel their designs. Both of them teach you everything the game will demand of you and force you to get good. I would even say that if you can beat Gascoine, you can beat the rest of the main game without too many hiccups. Margit definitely teaches you the most important lesson of all, which is leaving him be for a moment if the challenge is too much to handle, but Gascoine will cement the idea of Bloodborne in your mind. Playing aggressively is the beating heart of Bloodborne, and playing defensively isn't always the optimal option here. There's a lot of ideas that are shoved into Gascoine. What I tend to favor is how he feels like the classic From Software dance. But this is not a gentleman's agreement type of dance. The AI is designed so well that it doesn't feel like a back and forth pool similar to Sir Lon in Dark Souls 2. This is going to be a bloodbath, and someone is definitely leaving with a few cuts. This plays into the immersion that Bloodborne is so good at, as the dance that I described is really a dance. Father Gascoine, like you, is a hunter, and he uses his hunter tools throughout his boss fight. Almost everything that you can do, he can do as well. You're going to see Gascoine using his blunderbuss, dashing like a madman, using his one-handed axe, and the two-handed variation. His trick weapon transformation is a really well-hidden third phase that he has. Everything here plays into making Gascoine feel like an equal, a fellow hunter. Most From Software bosses tend to have the enemy character model larger than you by a fair amount. It's not always a given, and sometimes that rule is broken, but with every hunter boss fight in Bloodborne, the models are equal to the player, playing even further into the immersion that Bloodborne does so well. I also want to quickly touch upon his music box. FromSoft, in my opinion, has a shaky relationship with special items tailor-made for boss fights. Elden Ring has the most issues with them, but I don't find Gascoine's music box to be problematic in any way. Not understanding this weakness won't drastically alter the fight. At best, you get a few free hits in, and you have more story context if you put the puzzle together. It was well placed for an early boss, as it can help players that are struggling since Bloodborne's first level is arguably too hard. Again, very similar to Margit's Shackle in Elden Ring. Gascoine's last phase also doesn't crash the perfect Jenga set, as it's the last trial Bloodborne throws at you in order to progress. If I try to view Bloodborne as a new player, dying here is probably expected, as it's such a sudden change of pace and damage. His beast phase is absolutely relentless, and he does a better job at closing the distance than Cleric Beast ever did. He has a lot more speed and leaping attacks to not allow you to breathe. If I am right and dying is expected here, I think it's for the better. Everyone can kind of brute force their way through a boss, and the same logic applies here. My first kill on Sister Frida was nothing more than some good RNG because I left that fight not understanding what I was doing wrong. But dying on Gascoine's second phase and getting back to the third phase demonstrates that you have the grit to maneuver through the obstacles Bloodborne enemies will throw at you, making him one of the best bosses From Software has ever designed, and he is one of the few S-tier bosses in the base game. The slaughter through Old Yharnam leads to our third boss in the game, Bloodstarved Beast. There's something about Bloodstarved Beast that is equally terrifying and disgusting. He is one of the fastest beast enemies in the game, and his music reflects that. Almost immediately, his original soundtrack gets straight to the point and skips the nonsense. This boss is fast as hell, and he's faster than anything we saw in the past Souls games up to this point. His disgusting element is partially his design, his skin folds drooping over his body, but I tend to focus on his blood, or lack thereof. He doesn't actually bleed when you hit him. Instead, I can only assume his poison oozes out of his body when you hit him. Very similar to Millennia, the poison is part of him, and FromSoft usually does a good job at using player-sided debuffs in their boss fights without making them too annoying. Very rarely do they feel tacked on just for the sake of difficulty, and with how aggressive this boss is, it works quite well here. It intertwines quite well with his OST and the fight itself, like how a work of art such as a video game should. Everything aligns in a well thought out manner, with his poison chipping down your HP alongside the overall aggression of the boss, makes this fight one of the more frantic bosses in the game. Chances are you will be panicking if you don't know the boss moveset inside and out, as there's a lot to keep up with here, and it may be the most tense boss fight in the base game. I adore Bloodstarved Beast, and it's better than the sum of its parts. When the recipe of this boss is at its peak, it comes close to some of From Software's best work. He's a boss that I almost forgot about, but playing and analyzing him specifically has made me love him more than I thought I did. I didn't want criticism towards Bloodstarved Beast because it's not his fault, it's From Software's fault. It's From Software's fault for making Chalice dungeons. Ew. Inside the Bloodstarved Beast boss room is our first Chalice dungeon. Chalice dungeons in Bloodborne are universally disliked, and most people do everything in their power to avoid them. For example, if I ever hop on Bloodborne for a for fun playthrough, I will skip Chalice dungeons every single time. On the flip side, when I hop on Elden Ring for that same playthrough, I tend to not skip as much because it's not so out of the way like Chalice dungeons are. Chalice dungeons are nothing more than a painful chore that was included into Bloodborne, and I would even argue that it hurts the overall quality of the game. This video series is more so focusing on bosses, but I'm sure there are a few people watching that have never set foot in a Chalice dungeon before because of the negative reception surrounding them. There are some good ideas in Chalice dungeons, but for everything that it does well, it does even more wrong. Mainly Chalice Dungeon 4, which is just offensive. I will talk about Chalice Dungeons 1 through 5 in this video. Those are the main Chalice Dungeons From Software included in the game. So if you have not played Chalice Dungeons and want to skip around to see the bosses, this video is fully timestamped. And if you are contemplating doing Chalice Dungeons, since we won't have any new From Software content for a little while, I would scrub that idea from your brain because these things are some of the worst content that From Software has ever designed. Undead Giant is the first Chalice Dungeon boss, and he quickly demonstrates every issue with Chalice Dungeons. Getting to these bosses is a slog, and what a From Software boss isn't just their moveset. It's the build-up, the art, the music, the difficulty, and a lot more ideas that I can list off that you don't want to hear. Some of the criticism that I heard towards Shadow of the Erdtree was the lack of thematic build-up and cutscenes, and what I just described is nearly every Chalice Dungeon boss. And just because Undead Giant is the first dungeon doesn't mean he received special treatment. He's a large brute type character that will do a lot of damage if you suck at the game like I do here. He has a lot of hand swipes, some kicks, and he plays like a mixture of the last giant from Dark Souls 2 and the Knapsack Kidnapper in the base game. Someone could very easily encounter this enemy, think Chalice Dungeons are a side piece for levels or extra bits of lore, and completely forget about him once they exit this boss arena. He's very forgettable, and we have a lot more of them to get through. Well, I do at least. The three Watchers are very comparable to the Gang Squad trio in Dark Souls 2, and they're just as forgettable. They're not as offensive as Dark Souls 2 since that boss has reused assets from past games, but who cares? Dark Souls 2 is the black sheep of the family, so it's easier to shove its issues to the side. Bloodborne, however, is a golden baby that everyone loves, so it's not as easy to shove its issues to the side. The best way to deal with these guys is to either run in circles and wisely pick your time to attack, or simply parry them to death. Parrying in Bloodborne is way too easy until you hit the DLC, so I tend to do a mixture of both. These guys can be parried so easily that you can almost not know what their moveset is, because Chalice Dungeons should have been blended into the base game, because these guys would work as good level enemies to fight. Sadly, we are left with this slop. I think you're starting to understand why most people skip Chalice Dungeons almost every single playthrough. Welcome to one of the shittiest bosses From Software has ever made, Watchdogs of the Old Lords of the Fallen. Visually, he gives the impression that his moveset will match his appearance, but that's not the case at all. And why would it be? This is a Chalice Dungeon after all. This boss may not look bad on paper, but I assure you, nearly every single flaw that a boss can have is in this guy, and Chalice Dungeon 4 will highlight those flaws at every instance it can. So that's why I won't be talking about him that much, because you fight him again with half HP, but just know that this boss is a mixture of Dark Souls 2 hitboxes with zero adaptability, the overtuned damage of your least favorite Elden Ring boss, extremely fast moves that are hard to react to, and much, much more. If you have beaten Chalice Dungeon 4, I expect you to be doing a head nod right now because someone understands the pain that is Chalice Dungeon 4. And if you have not done this boss in Chalice Dungeon 4, consider yourself lucky. Because by the time you're hearing this audio, I've done it twice, and I'm surprised I didn't go insane. Or maybe I didn't, and I don't know that I've gone insane because I'm typing this out before I've done Chalice Dungeon 4. Because of my past PTSD with this boss, I am giving him a negative Z tier ranking. You can sit in the corner with frigid outskirts. Vicar Amelia's cutscene really embodies what Bloodborne is. Bloodborne's greatest asset is by far its atmosphere and gripping immersion. There simply aren't many bosses or areas in this game that completely miss the mark in that department, but there are a handful of bosses that do strike out with mechanics and even difficulty when you look at the Chalice Dungeons. It's a trade-off that some people will simply not enjoy, but I happen to enjoy it a lot. The Old Hunters blended these two ideas together, and that's why it's still regarded as one of the best DLCs From Software has ever made. Vicar Amelia reaches that perfect blend that Bloodborne has. She isn't the best example, but she can represent the highs of what a Bloodborne boss can be. Her attacks are surprisingly well telegraphed, and she feels like fighting a better version of the Cleric Beast. They even use the same soundtrack in case you didn't notice. She isn't a beast-type enemy such as Gascoine Phase 2 where he is just as aggressive as the player. Grab attacks and her predictability makes her a good change of pace, and she most likely got done with blood-starved beasts or witches of Hemwick prior to her. She hits the perfect middle ground of difficulty since we are slowly approaching the mid-game. You can even make the fight easier if you stick behind her and attack her from behind. The only thing I would have liked to see here is a new soundtrack to accompany one of the better boss movesets we've seen up until now. The Witches of Hemwick are definitely one of two things, a filler boss that From Software added to increase the boss count, or a boss design that needed more time. There's simply not enough in this boss to suggest that From Software had some grandiose plan to make them something special, so I have to assume the latter. Some may call this boss offensive since it's so monotonous, and I don't think that criticism would be harsh as this boss is pretty bad. These two do exemplify why some people earnestly believe that Bloodborne is not this top tier masterpiece that it's been set out to be. Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring offer more quality bosses and level enemies. When we get around to Dark Souls 3, it'll be an interesting showcase to see how these two games were being made together but are not alike. Dark Souls 3 is criticized for being too familiar, but it has a great set of bosses, while Bloodborne is praised for being unique but doesn't have as good of bosses. It's not even hard to demonstrate the weaknesses of this boss. It's slow paced, you've seen the shadow enemies before, and you can even infinitely damage one of the witches if you position yourself correctly for backstab staggers. If you do want to make these two even easier, you can spend all of your insight at the Hunter's Dream, and the shadow enemies will not spawn. And those enemies are the closest thing to a challenge that this boss offers. If you let them continuously spawn, you could end up with a few in the boss room and could eventually get ganged up on and subsequently one-shot. If these two didn't have the ability to unlock rings in the game, they would be an easy skip recommendation. Darkbeast Paarl is a boss that I would usually complain about, but I don't think much of that will be happening here. In my Dark Souls 1 video, I have the same logic where the Painted World really just feels like a free piece of add-on content that was given to us. The early trip to the Unseen Village when the knapsack guy kidnaps you sets an oppressive mood and creates that atmosphere Bloodborne is known for. So in my own way, I think this boss reminds me of Priscilla the most. I appreciate her more for what she is rather than judging her for what she isn't. Because Darkbeast Paarl isn't a significant boss and won't leave your jaw dropped when it's all said and done. He's a very brittle boss, and when you do come here properly leveled, you may even steamroll him by accident. I tried to come here properly leveled, and I think I was close to where I was supposed to be. When he is powered up with his lightning, he has that Bloodborne flair where something is grotesque yet visually appealing. The trick up his sleeve is that he is at his strongest when he is powered up, and your goal is to stagger him out of that lightning form. When he's not in that lightning form, he's a joke and won't give anyone much trouble. But his lightning form does have a few strong attacks to watch out for, mainly his electric explosion that was knocking out 3/4 of my health bar. Again, this boss is the Priscilla, where I enjoy him for what he is, and I would never skip this guy on subsequent playthroughs. Beast-possessed Soul is a mob enemy that you can only see once at the very bottom of this platforming section here. At least, I think he is. I killed him and didn't grab footage of him. Womp womp. I don't remember the main game mob having these fireball spells that he has now, but still, he's just another forgettable Chalice dungeon boss, and this move where he swipes left and right just looks stupid. The animation speed could have been increased to make this enemy feel more ruthless with his attacks. Instead, he just looks like he's moving in slow motion. Keeper of the Old Lords is our first Chalice dungeon boss that has quality in this fight. It's nothing spectacular, but this boss feels like it had some vision that From Software wanted to bring to life. She is one of Bloodborne's better Chalice dungeon models, and that's saying something because most of the models in here aren't that visually appealing. It's easy enough to turn off your brain and beat her up until phase 2 because her second phase is at least worth talking about. This boss fight isn't particularly challenging, but she can burst you down with just a few spells. Some may say that is overtuned, and they may be right, but she isn't something that most people will struggle with, since she is a glass cannon. It's very easy to take out massive chunks of her health with just a few attacks, making her just an okay boss, but a sad example of a good Chalice dungeon boss. So, we finally reached a good Chalice Dungeon exclusive enemy, and I have to say, it's a shame that there are a lot of players that will never experience a pretty good boss only because Chalice Dungeons are a fucking chore. This is what I mean by Chalice Dungeons hurting the overall quality of Bloodborne. We could have had another level or two with a few of these bosses thrown into that level for a better base game experience. However, I digress, and I suppose that has nothing to do with this boss. Pthumerian Descendant was clearly designed well and play tested with care. Our other Chalice Dungeon bosses have mixed quality, but that in-between quality scale doesn't reside here. Seeing an enemy fight with 2 sickles crosses a unique box that can be checked, as I simply can't remember any other enemy that fights with weapons like these. The weapons you get from killing Eileen are kind of similar, but they don't quite hit the mark. From Software even had him use these weapons within his fight, as he will throw them at you for a ranged ability. He's a pretty good boss with a good moveset, but since he is in a Chalice dungeon, he suffers from the Rennala syndrome, where he has a poor build-up, no cutscene, and lacks everything else that goes into a great boss. So, we finally reached my favorite boss type encounter, gank bosses. And since we just got off of Dark Souls 2, a game with plenty of gank type enemies, I should love this one, right? I mean, I'm the kind of person that doesn't hate on the Ruined Sentinels, so I will vehemently praise these 3, right? No, I will not. The main reason is out of spite, but I'll cover that near the end. But first, I should play fair and compliment these guys because they do deserve some credit. The Ruined Sentinels in Dark Souls 2 shared the same AI moveset, and when that happened, it's like watching fireworks. If you've seen one, you've seen them all. It's also funny how these two games, Dark Souls 2 and Bloodborne, could have had some of the better gank fights, but they end up having a mixed bag in Dark Souls 2, and flat out bad ones in Bloodborne. Bloodborne's rally health system can utilize gank fights with the heal, and Dark Souls 2 has unlimited healing with life gems. These 3 will come back as mob enemies later in the game, but they do have some unique properties within their boss fight, as they do have multiple phases and unique subterranean snake attacks that do come into play later. Where the fight becomes slightly more interesting is when the transition to phase 2 happens and they grow snakes out of their bodies. One of them can even perform some sort of ritual to call upon snakes that were coiled below, making for some interesting spectacle within this fight. And that is most of these guys. It can be a bit easy to become staggered by a fire attack leading to a quick and painful death, or even have their extended limbs burst you down, but that's something that I can live with even with the painfully long run back to this boss. Where my spite comes in is from the fact that I have a love-hate relationships with snakes. I'm deathly terrified of them in real life, and the first time I ran into the Great Serpent in Sekiro, I audibly gasped, and in general, snakes in games always terrify me. But I do like to see them, and if you didn't know, this boss was most likely going to be a large snake ball boss. I don't exactly know why From Software cut this boss from the game, but I have to assume it was just because of time restraints. The very cool Lance McDonald used his talent to either mod or jailbreak this boss into the game, and when I initially saw this video, I immediately thought about how much cooler a finished boss like this would have been. Obviously, it is very hard to tell how it would have worked out, and it very well could have been a bad boss, but I think I would have liked it more for the horror that I would have felt killing him. An easy counterpoint someone can make is that the really large enemies in the older games were sometimes uninspired and a slog to fight. All you have to do is look back at the Hydra in Dark Souls 1 for a bland, large enemy. I still think that the large snake ball would have been well suited for this area. Most people have a fear of spiders or snakes, so having back-to-back phobia bosses may have been a bit too much. ROM has some similarities to other bosses where the atmosphere, build-up, and story are more interesting than the boss itself. Just as a quick example, her boss arena is still a captivating and immersive arena to be in. It's almost like Gotham and Batman. The arena and story is just as integral to the boss fight. I think that Rennala is the perfect version of this idea, but ROM deserves credit for starting it. An idea that I had when I was making my Dark Souls 2 video is how Freya should have continuously spawned the spiderlings in her arena. I think the spiders were arguably done better in Dark Souls 2, as much as I hate to say that, as it forced you to make a conscious decision on whether or not you would keep your torch to remove the spider threats or focus down the ads and then you can worry about the boss later. With ROM, I usually find it better to maneuver through the ads and mainly focus on the boss. You can kill the ads that surround her, but since there are so many and you have to position yourself to kill them, I find them to be a tedious enemy to deal with. Very similar to the snake ball that FromSoft wanted to do originally with our last boss, ROM simply doesn't do much of anything that's interesting. You mainly have to tackle this boss in a textbook manner. Understand the few moves ROM has, and be wary of the ads that surround you. Because of that, I don't find fighting the boss to be a gripping experience, even with the greatness surrounding her. Although, the ending cutscene to ROM does foreshadow our last boss in the Chalice dungeon, making this cutscene just a little bit more special in my mind. The Amygdala has an intriguing design element that I didn't notice until I was starting to review my footage. This design from software pulled off with the Amygdala very well may be a sort of lightning in a bottle, as I've never seen them do this again. What From Software pulled off here is how you have a colossal enemy model that you have to fight. This makes for the classic From Software power experience where the player is the weaker of the two and you have to overpower the enemy. The hidden design behind this is how the game nudges at you and winks at you to tell you where to position yourself without having some sort of marker to hold your hand. I do need to thank my strength brain for trying this, but as you can see when I attack the Amygdala's feet, I'm essentially healing the enemy. My damage is so low that the game is telling me that I'm not utilizing proper attacks. And when you stand and face the Amygdala head on, the camera works impeccably. There will be little to no issues, and that's saying a lot for bosses of this size. It works better than almost every other giant boss model in the Soulsborne games. Of course, Guardian Ape still has the best camera, but this is, well, in my opinion, an achievement that From Software did here, and I hope my next talking point doesn't kill my camera momentum, but something that would have benefited this boss is having more lock-on spots. Since you can really only damage the guy from the head or arms, having dedicated lock-on spots to the arms could have gone a long way. Although, From Software probably knew about that. If a fan in his room can think of it, so can FromSoft. And they either didn't think it was necessary, or they didn't want players fighting with the camera lock-on when the camera itself works well here. Either way, I've said the word camera enough for this boss, so let's talk about the mechanic. The Amygdala is one of my favorite cosmic beings in the game. Really, that's most of Bloodborne for me. Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring have better bosses, but Bloodborne's artistic vision of the bosses are still the highlight of the game for me, and what makes it to this day one of my favorite Soulsborne games. That does carry most of Bloodborne, because if you were to judge most of the bosses by grey character models, they wouldn't amount to much. While I do love how the Amygdala looks, the overall pace of the fight can become tiresome with no fault to the player. Hitting the Amygdala's limbs can be a bit of an awkward task depending on your weapon, and you will miss a few unless you have the perfect weapon for this fight. Missing a few lanky limbs because of a skill FromSoft is never really demanded can lead to a prolonged fight versus an enemy with a moveset that isn't entirely engaging by itself. Overall, I guess I just described half of Bloodborne's base game bosses. If you do only care about gameplay and how cool bosses and enemies are to fight, Bloodborne likely isn't high on your list. The one Reborn is one of the most disappointing bosses in all of Bloodborne, but it's also an interesting case study when you zoom in on the finer details. This boss is pushing the final act of the game, and this is usually when we'd start to see an epic boss ahead of us, but the upcoming bosses are, well, disappointing and lackluster. I think Bloodborne as a whole was becoming rushed, and I don't think it's hard to see that. From Software was juggling Dark Souls 2, this game, and Dark Souls 3 simultaneously. Juggling these three Soulsborne games is obviously a lot, but Bloodborne was also doing more than what we were used to. We had a new setting, new combat, new lore, and most importantly, Chalice dungeons. Chalice dungeons are the highlight here, and they were honestly just a mistake if you ask me. From Software should have cut the notion that these were going to be developed, and in my opinion, cutting them would have most likely made the base game better. I'm not saying that Chalice dungeons are the sole reason for this boss being a ripoff of Tower Knight, but FromSoft not spreading themselves so thin would most likely have made Bloodborne a better experience. Because that's just what this boss is, a Tower Knight ripoff. It's not even a better iteration of what Tower Knight was attempting, it's almost the same thing, cut and paste. I should also make a note, I don't think this is a nod to their past games. Something like Jester in Dark Souls 1's DLC is seen as foreshadowing to Bloodborne, and when Bloodborne eventually got revealed, fans were able to catch on. The Pizza Cutter in Elden Ring is a nod to Bloodborne. This is a poor remaster of a boss. Whatever FromSoft did that was new with this boss didn't work, it's the same one-note boss that was in Demon Souls. I tried to not levy harsh criticism on the Tower Knight, saying that Demon Souls was a weird, funky game for its time, and it not being a grand, epic boss for 2009 is completely understandable. But standards do get raised with each sequel, unless you're Ubisoft or Bethesda, and now we're left with this. To be fair, the music in this boss fight is absolutely epic, and just maybe the camera works slightly better here. This boss is entirely disappointing, and I would be willing to give it a pass if I think it attempted something new and interesting, but sadly, it didn't. Well, it's the 3 Watchers again. It's the same boss that we fought before, but now we get to fight them with mid-game stats. Fucking hell, Chalice dungeons really were a mistake. Anyway, as I said, nothing's been changed besides their health and damage, so I mainly resort to playing it slow and steady, and I rely on parrying my way through the fight. It's hard for me to really tell if there's a skill issue or not, but they feel overtuned. But what I do know is that they're not fun, and they're not fun to talk about, so let's move on. Whoever designed this fight enjoys pain. It's as simple as that. They're the kind of person that will sit on their phone and watch people's pimples being popped. Yeah, this boss is overtuned. His damage output is absolutely ridiculous, and one hit can lead to 3/4 of your HP being popped. It took me a rather embarrassing 12 minutes to kill this boss. Part of this is because I'm bad, sure, but he's also extremely tanky, high DPS, and he's hard to dodge. He'll do this move where he turns his body in a 360-degree motion, and his chains are a really annoying roll catch. You can dodge this, but I don't know how I brute force my way through this fight. I would at least like to say that he looks interesting, but he suffers from what I dislike about the Rotten in Dark Souls 2, where I just think he's ugly in an uninteresting way. This boss sucks, Chalice dungeons suck, and they take away from Bloodborne as a whole. Chalice dungeons were just so depressing that I had to move back to the main game, and I saved Logarius for a good reason because he's a great step up and has almost everything going for him. His level is yet another well-designed layout to traverse. The change in atmosphere is more than welcome as you are surrounded by snow. Pretty much everything here is what I would say a win. The only thing that I don't welcome is the laborious boss runback, but the newer the release, the less likely these tedious time wastes are to appear. Logarius has an achievement that few bosses do. He stands as a really well-designed caster mage boss and later transitions into a melee hybrid build. A boss like Rennala in Elden Ring, while cool, mainly relies on the spectacle and first phase gimmick to make her memorable, although mechanically she really isn't that special. Other games that implement a strong caster enemy can create an annoying feeling for the player rather than a fun challenge to overcome. That annoyance can arise if you don't catch on to the fact that his sword that he places in the ground can be destroyed. If you don't catch on to that, this boss will be annoying when you dogpile the tedious run on top of an already challenging boss. I would go as far to argue that this would be no fault of the player, as Bloodborne has never taught you that bosses can use outside resources you have to destroy. Although that's enough of that. I do think that this is a great idea, although it could have been done better. FromSoftware could have done a better job at nudging at you that this sword is a huge thing of power and you can destroy it and it's not this untouchable thing, but I digress. When Phase 2 accelerates to full speed, it still contains the magic that Logarius has, and it's that he still uses some caster moves and becomes an aggressive foe. When these types of bosses come to life, it makes it feel like I'm fighting versus someone with a build, and it's nice to see a boss be something of a jack of all trades. Great bosses in these games, such as Artorias or Fume Knight, are duelists, if you will. They are really good at dueling with their weapons, but having enemies that have a mixture of everything does lead to a great boss fight like we have here. I don't exactly think Logarius is the best base game boss in Bloodborne, but he is without a doubt a top 3 boss fight. I still think Gascoine is the best base game boss, but my opinion does change pretty rapidly when I play these games again. There are some special ideas that FromSoftware understands with their games, and arguably Bloodborne does this the best. It's the idea that not every boss has to be a mechanical masterpiece that test your skill and make you get good. Elden Ring really shied away from this the most, as there's a lot of mechanically interesting bosses in that game, but few bosses that have a different focus, such as Micolash. Micolash is that type of boss where you won't be mechanically challenged, and what he challenges you on is having some patience. The closest comparison I can think of to resemble Micolash is folding screen monkeys, and that by itself is a stretch. You'll be doing a lot of running around with both fights, and I don't think I can pinpoint which boss I like more. I do think folding screen monkeys were executed better, as most will not have any issue beating them on their first try. Even if you do somehow die, they are at their very core a gimmick, so killing the monkeys that you had already killed won't be a slog. Where Micolash succeeds is his atmosphere, music, and even some shock factor of him jumping through the mirrors. And I like all of that. What I don't like as much is how much of a slog this boss is if you die. He's not a hard boss by any means, but dying is a part of these games, and his encounter is a slog if you do happen to die. Dying here is overly punishing as the fight itself is so long and one-dimensional. Mechanically, depth bosses rarely turn into a chore because their mechanics are engaging enough to keep your attention. Micolash doesn't have that, and he's almost like the Tower Knight in Demon Souls. He's a very one-note boss. You will do his encounter almost identically each time you fight him. You trap him in the same set of rooms, chase him around, and fight him. His damage can also be quite high, and bursting you down with his magic isn't an unseen set of events. I like the idea of a long boss fight such as him. I don't like how it becomes so tedious if you fail once or twice. A boss such as Bed of Chaos, for example, had checkpoints in the boss fight itself, as the shields on the side of his boss arena didn't respawn if you died. So I feel like this boss had a vision by From Software, but they didn't care to make it fun if you die, or on repeat playthroughs. Micolash does have strong atmosphere and story, but I wouldn't give him a gold star with what he succeeds at. What is most likely more of a lore boss, the Celestial Emissary is mechanically a better Royal Rat Vanguard from Dark Souls 2. This idea still isn't remarkable, it's a bunch of ads in an arena, and you carve through them. What makes these guys better than Royal Rat Vanguard is the fact that no one wants to beat up rabies. Rabies is bad, and carving through some aliens is a lot more thematically engaging. There's also a really big emissary in this boss fight itself to help this boss feel slightly more unique and stand out just a little bit more. Not really a whole lot to be done here, this place is mainly just a setup for our next boss. Ebrietas is a testament to From Software and really all of Bloodborne's art direction, as I have never heard someone criticize Ebrietas' art direction. In fact, that's the one thing everyone will agree on with this boss. She is a very unique enemy and is arguably a lot more interesting than most of Bloodborne. Mechanically, it has a lot of textbook check marks to make a boss interesting. A few ranged moves, some melee moves with some spectacle thrown in to make it that much better. She is a large enemy, so the camera can become a bit ridiculous at times, mainly when she does her head slam. I sometimes get disoriented, but that's something veteran Souls players are used to by this point. And as I have Shadow of the Erdtree fresh in my mind, the Mother of Fingers boss fight is the closest From Software has attempted at recreating this boss, and they both possess the same unique trait of watching them move, and seeing what they do is more interesting than actually engaging in the dance that From Software bosses are known for. So if you can wrap your brain around the fact that these are more interesting to look at than fight, I think you'll like this boss. So we're at the final stretch of Bloodborne's base game bosses, and if you really want, the final boss of Bloodborne. After this, you can talk to Gherman and end the game right there, so giving players an epic boss probably would have been welcome here, as Mergo's wet nurse doesn't reach that standard. The best way I can describe Mergo is that she's easier to understand than most of Bloodborne's bosses, and that's probably due to the fact that she does fight with weapons, and doesn't wield some weird cosmic magic or fight with her body. This makes the majority of her fight kind of stale for me, and the only time it kicks up a notch is when she dims the lights and attacks us from different angles, which makes it so there's a lot more to look out for. I did end up knocking her out of this phase on my first run, didn't know you could do that, but I did get footage of it when she killed me. I have heard that you can run in circles and avoid this phase, but that would make for a really boring talking piece here. If you do ignore this mechanic, then maybe she's even less interesting than what I think she is, but if you do engage with the mechanic, then it does add some spectacle into her fight. Yeah, not the greatest base game boss in Bloodborne. Next. Chalice dungeons really are poor content in Bloodborne, and I honestly believe that if you skip this content, it will lead to an all-around better experience on this game. Rom has no good reason to appear in Chalice dungeons, period. If you wanted me to, I can spew off reasons until this video hits the 12-hour mark, but let me just say, this content is worse than the most annoying Elden Ring reuses. Say what you want about Elden Ring, but I think it's pretty awesome. Every game has flaws. Elden Ring designed so much content that a lot of it had to be pushed to the max and reused more than it should have been to justify its creation. But in return, we got a huge game with high quality content, and most would say it was worth the endeavor and what was sacrificed to get there. However, Bloodborne is not Elden Ring. Bloodborne is a very traditional Souls game where the content is much more finite, but in return, you expect a higher quality start to finish. And Chalice dungeons are not that, and it's unacceptable. I do not care if Chalice dungeons are easy to skip. They took development time, and that time could have been shoved into the main game. So that's why Rom is as offensive as Godskin Duo in Elden Ring. And since this boss is so offensive, I decided to summon. I broke my rule, and it's that I do not summon in these games, ever. I do not think summoning is fun, it usually takes away from my experience, but this content is at the bottom of the barrel. To give you a quick perspective, this is worse than Lost Izalith. The spiders are completely overtuned, as I have extremely high HP here and I was being bursted by these spiders in just a few hits. Rom's spells also hit like a truck, and this boss was clearly designed to be fought in an arena with what feels like unlimited space. Most of Bloodborne's bosses are not strong mechanical fights, but they do take advantage of every other aspect that makes Bloodborne the masterpiece that it is, so why From Software decided to design content that takes you away from Bloodborne's gripping atmosphere is beyond me. It's like how Bethesda made Starfield's planets the way they did, and it took away from their only strength. You know what, I just went back and read what I had typed and I'm a little bit embarrassed. This was just a rant on Chalice Dungeons, but I think they finally broke me. Fuck Chalice Dungeons. Once I am done with them for this section of the video, I will never touch them again. Ever. Yeah, it's the same boss again, because these are Chalice Dungeons, so why would it be different? Well, if you skipped here the timestamp for whatever reason, you can listen to the ROM section that was 30 seconds ago for my thoughts. I think Chalice Dungeons are making Elden Ring my favorite of the batch. It was Bloodborne a few months ago, but I think I need to judge the game as a whole, and Chalice Dungeons are one of Bloodborne's core parts. My mind is made up. Chalice Dungeons are so bad, Elden Ring is now my favorite. I mean, Shadow of the Erdtree was pretty awesome, so I guess it deserves the spot. FromSoft, is this really what you're going to do? Bloodstarved Beast is epic. I like him, but I don't want to fight him here. He doesn't even feel that fun to fight. He simply does not feel like his stats were properly balanced here, as he simply wasn't doing much damage, and I was able to take him head on with very little worry. Give me the lowest Dark Souls 2 boss over Chalice Dungeons and I'd be grateful by this point. Holy shit, Chalice Dungeons suck. The footage that you're seeing for this boss is actually footage that is close to 4 years old now. I ended up saving this footage because I thought this boss was super cool and never got rid of it. I also forgot to record this guy, so very convenient on my part. What I will say is that when I was fighting him with a heavy weapon, he felt much harder than what his gameplay looks like here, and from what I remember, this kill you're seeing was my Platinum Trophy run on Bloodborne, so the Chalice Dungeon fatigue hadn't set in yet. But once it does set in, you simply cannot reverse it. It's like a virus stuck in your brain. No matter how much you want to like them, you just can't. So I kind of fucked up on the Chalice Dungeon order and was doing optional Chalice Dungeons instead of the main Chalice Dungeons. What a waste of time. I hate it. Well, Bloodletting Beast is required to continue forth the horrendous journey of Chalice Dungeons, so let's talk about him. Oh wait, maybe we shouldn't because I came in here and slaughtered him without being able to see much of what he does. He does have an interesting grab attack he can perform, but I gladly didn't get to see much of him. He feels just as unfinished as Chalice Dungeons as a whole, but that's okay because our next Chalice Dungeon will reduce my health by half, so that'll be fun for me. Oh so fun. So now I'm in Chalice Dungeon 4 where my HP is halved. I'm giving every boss in here an F grade. Call it petty, you're probably right, but it's a lazy, horrible design and all of these bosses are enemies that I've fought before. Keeper of the Old Laurence is the least offensive half HP boss, but I still hate it. For some, it's a skill check of parrying, and that can lead to some joy. I get no joy. I get no joy because I'm in a Chalice Dungeon. This boss killed me when I was at 1 HP, so I took the easy way out and fucked her in a corner with my pizza cutter. Now this is what I call cheesing a boss, and I have no shame. Waterfowl is a better designed move than anything in this Chalice Dungeon. So here we are, Chalice Dungeon 4's hardest boss, and I don't even know where to start. Luckily, I have grown as a person, and I'm not as stubborn as I was back in 2020 when I was doing this. Back then, I refused to summon because I was that damn fixated on soloing the fucking Chalice Dungeons. That led me to waste hours upon hours doing this boss. I still have memories of dying from that dark time. But on this kill, I shook my head. No, I said. I will summon. Because this fight is bullshit. He's arguably the hardest boss in all of Bloodborne and almost everything he does is working against him. The most offensive thing he realistically does is this charge move here. If you were to tally together every death in this dungeon, you would see a horrific stat where this charge has solo killed many poor hunters. This charge will one-shot you in almost every distance, and the best way to avoid this charge is to not do Chalice Dungeons at all. But here we are. You should only be attacking once for a patient kill and twice if you're desperate. If he does start his charge while you're attacking, then you're dead. It's as simple as that. You're gone. Do not get confused because this is artificial difficulty at its core. FromSoftware either had more intricate plans with a half-health idea, or they felt like getting back at players for all the Dark Souls 2 criticism. This artificial difficulty doesn't just stop at the charge or the half HP, it's also the stupid run back to the sky. This run back may be a nitpick because it is, but I hate this boss, so I'm gonna do it. This is the hardest content in the game and you will die to bullshit for half of your deaths. So wasting my time further with this run back is just offensive, and it's not even a bad run back when compared to some of the other things we've seen. I also just don't like his mohawk he has. I just think it looks dumb, and that's all. I just don't like it. I'm sure there's more hitbox issues than what I encountered, but if you thought that I was going to purposefully extend my time with this boss, you'd be wrong, because it sucks. Luckily, FromSoftware gave us the option to summon in this fight, or I simply wouldn't have beaten it. I would rather go to Frigid Outskirts blindfolded while holding my controller upside down than Chalice Dungeon 4. The final Chalice Dungeon 4 boss is yet another rematch versus a base game boss. Like everything else in Chalice Dungeon 4, this is pure artificial difficulty where one single mistake against an enemy with a bloated health bar will kill you. If he slams his arm and you get a bad hitbox or simply mistime your dodge, you are dead. This is not fun design. What makes this fight even more frustrating is the fact that the Amygdala isn't worth the time learning his moveset to perfection like some of the other bosses would be. The frustration will multiply since he has a lanky body, making it very easy to miss one of his limbs in a dungeon where every bit of damage is crucial. I hate this boss, and the difficulty is so blatantly annoying that it's offensive. It's so offensive that I cheesed this boss and I do not feel bad about it. I looked up a guide, upgraded Ludwig's Holy Blade, and made this boss as easy as possible. If you give players an unfun form of difficulty, it usually leads to the majority of them lacking the grit to do it on their own, and then they will simply follow the meta. I have nothing positive or constructive to say about this, as it's very clearly unfinished content that was for some reason shoved into the base game. And finally, the last set of Chalice dungeon bosses are upon us. Pthumerian Descendant has always been the best mechanical fight in these dungeons, and you know what? When I killed him, I had a sense of dread in my soul, and I was a bit sad. I know, it's a bit embarrassing to even say that, but I was. The Souls games are special to me, and it's not just a game series I like. I love them. And even the ones I criticize a lot, such as Dark Souls 2, I have grown to love that game in its own way. I was sad that I killed this guy because I know for a fact that it will be the last time I kill him in my entire life. Chalice dungeons simply are not worth the many chores that the game demands of you just to have the opportunity to fight him. The only way I will fight him again is if this game gets some sort of remake and the remake goes to PC and then someone develops a boss rush mode mod. We all know that Sony isn't smart enough to do that, so a man can dream. They would rather dump $150 million into some shitty live service game than grab some free money. I do actually think this game will get a remake when the PS6 launches, but it's ridiculous that's been stuck at 30 FPS for so long alongside PlayStation's shitty hardware. You know how I said that I was a bit upset that I wouldn't ever see our last boss? Well, that's not the case here. This boss sucks, his camera is bad, his movement is less than mid, and a better boss reuse could have been placed here. Goodbye, Bloodletting Beast, I won't be missing you. And the dread has been revived in my soul. The Pthumerian Queen has been subtly foreshadowed throughout the base game of Bloodborne. The two times that I noticed her is right after Rom's cutscene and before Mergo's wet nurse. I'm sure I could have missed another time she was hinted at, but these two instances are what I remember. Bloodborne's Chalice dungeons without a doubt needed a rework from the ground up, and each Chalice dungeon tier should have had a completely unique boss, such as her as the final boss in the Chalice dungeon. For example, Chalice Dungeon 1 should have had its own unique boss, and that sentiment would continue to Chalice Dungeon 2, 3, 4, and end with the Pthumerian Queen. So you can probably see where I'm going with this, right? The painful bore that are Chalice Dungeons does not offer enough to make this final boss worth the grind to climb here, and I would know about climbing. I spent 5 years playing League of Legends chasing a pointless rank, and somehow Chalice Dungeons feel worse. It's just a shame because I do think that her qualities in this fight are worth talking about, things that I vehemently enjoy. Of course, this is Bloodborne, so she looks intriguing. I adore how she isn't another monster, and she's spooky in her own way. This fight also has a wonderful original soundtrack. Music that sadly won't be heard by many because Chalice Dungeons are just so disliked in the community. It's such a shame that genuine, quality work was put into this boss and very few will experience it. To get my complaint out of the way, I do wish we had a completely unique boss arena. This boss arena does feel like another Chalice dungeon arena, which in my mind does take away from her boss fight. Her mechanics are engaging as well. She reminds me a little bit of Martyr Logarius and Nito from Dark Souls 1. Where Logarius comes into play is how she does have blood magic and melee tools at her disposal, making her feel like a real boss with a real kit instead of the slop that we saw in Chalice Dungeons. Her Nito resemblances are very obvious blood spikes that will rise from the ground. She is a 3-phase fight, and seeing these 3-phase fights is always a welcome for me, as Elden Ring didn't have many great 3-phase fights. Her last phase is her coating her weapon with blood, and things are at their most tense here, with her duplicates shooting magic at you, the magic she spawns, and her melee attack. She's a really good fight, and I have to quickly say that I was wrong, and I'm sorry. What I'm about to say isn't really related to bosses, so if you want to move on, and then I understand, you can feel free to skip ahead to the DLC as this video is fully timestamped. But I was unfair when I did my Souls ranking video. My logic was that you can easily skip Chalice Dungeons, so I didn't really take them into account, and I was wrong. I have to judge the game as a whole, and Chalice Dungeons are an undeniable huge part to Bloodborne. Bloodborne is close to my #1 favorite From Software game, but I simply cannot put it in my #1 spot anymore because of Chalice Dungeons. It would be like saying, well, Elden Ring has 10 out of 10 boss fights if you only talk about the Remembrance bosses. I simply don't think that's fair logic, and you also have to include some of the worst offenders even if they are a skippable fight. I was completely biased towards Bloodborne, and I would put Dark Souls 2 as the second worst and Demon's Souls dead last. I was wrong. And I wish I can change that video, but I still think that the rest of my commentary holds up. But I do have to say Chalice Dungeons really suck, and they do bring down Bloodborne. Ludwig is a testament to how From Software always at any given moment delivers with their DLC. Each From Software game that has received a DLC without fail always elevates the weaker aspect of the game itself. Shadow of the Erdtree may not fall into that category as it is just more Elden Ring, but it is more Elden Ring that doesn't have the filler that the base game had. Dark Souls 1 stepped at the bosses and gave you a reason to keep playing after ONS. Dark Souls 2's DLCs dragged the game out of mediocrity, and Bloodborne delivers more S-tier bosses that the game really needed. I got a lot of flack for not putting the Old Hunters as my favorite DLC before Shadow of the Erdtree came out, but I do have to say, it doesn't matter because From Software makes some of the best DLCs in the entire industry. Okay, DLC glazing over, now it's time to glaze Ludwig, who is my second favorite boss From Software has ever made. There's a real step up in cinematography here in the DLC. The cutscenes that are in the Old Hunters are some of FromSoft's best work to this day, and I would even go as far to say that they are still all better than Shadow of the Erdtree. At first, you may be a bit disappointed if this was the first boss to Bloodborne's DLC. Ludwig appears to be another beast-type enemy with swipes, a dash, similar to Ebrietas, and a ranged move. But the first phase is really just a warm-up for Phase 2. Phase 2 in this boss fight is one of the most powerful moments that I've ever seen in a boss fight. There's a real change of power here, and it will immediately wash away any doubts someone may have had about this boss. You may have not wanted a rampaging horse to fight, you may have even thought he was too easy, but as soon as you see the mid-phase transition cutscene, you know that the scales are no longer favored towards you. Ludwig has an internal revelation and yields his guiding moonlight with skill and finesse. This right here is one of the most powerful moments in a boss for me. This is fucking hype. The Old Hunters has the best music when compared to other original soundtracks that From Software has made. Here, just listen to this for a quick moment. If that doesn't make you excited to fight this guy, I don't know what will. It's not only that, there's so much more. Let's take Baal as a quick example. Baal is one of my favorite fights in Shadow of the Erdtree, and he is From Software's best dragon. But a lot of other games on the market have dragon boss fights. None of them are as good as Martyr or Baal, but I can fight dragons somewhere else. But I simply cannot name another game where I can fight a huge Gigachad horse that has a huge goddamn sword with this hype music. I mean, just look at how he stands. Look at him. This is why I don't give a fuck about graphics at a certain point, because this dude is just fucking cool. He's menacing as hell, and by God, he's perfect. This phase is so good that I don't even get mad when I die. When I was dying on the final boss of Elden Ring's DLC, I was starting to get frustrated because I was getting bursted down so fast, and I was getting tired of his moveset, but I can legitimately sit down for hours and fight Ludwig. I know a lot of people think that Mesmer or Radon or Midra are better fights than Ludwig, and I'm happy for you. Enjoy those fights, but not for me. Nope, not even close. I'm going to get a lot of flack when I get around to Elden Ring, but there isn't a single Elden Ring boss that comes close to Ludwig for me. Baal kind of comes close, and if Baal wasn't a dragon and he was something super fascinating like how Ludwig is, then maybe he would even surpass him, but he didn't. I can't lie, he may even be my favorite boss. I still think Gale is number 1, but Ludwig is a very close number 2. I cannot find a single flaw in his boss fight, and whatever flaws are present don't really bother me because I think he's just that awesome. He is an SSSSS tier fight. For some, the living failures are a roadblock that get in the way to top tier Bloodborne content, and I guess I can see where they're coming from. This whole level is leading up to Lady Maria, and having a sudden halt and a subversion of your expectations can come off as jarring to some people, but I do welcome them to Bloodborne as a whole. They are a gimmick boss that allows the DLC to breathe, making it a more balanced experience. That was something that Shadow of the Erdtree was potentially missing, some breathing room. Regardless, these guys do an okay job at being a weird spectacle boss. The living failures simply aren't like anything that we've seen before. They are tanky and call upon cosmic spells for most of their damage. It can be easy to be bursted down by these guys if too many of the living failures are in the boss arena at one time, making a reactive playstyle more of my jam when I'm not entirely over-leveled. They are an easy parry, and this DLC did step up the overall parry challenge, and Lady Maria will highlight that. These guys are nothing special, but it is by no means offensive content. At the very worst, you will think that this 10-minute fight wasn't worth the inclusion, but it's nothing that takes away from the overall experience of the Old Hunters. Lady Maria is a close resemblance to Mesmer in Elden Ring's DLC. These two characters were the bread and butter when it came to the overall design and marketing. Mesmer was at the front and center of marketing. He was placed in story trailers, and he was the flashiest boss in Elden Ring's DLC. Lady Maria was by no means the highlight for marketing trailers, but she is at the front and center cover art of the DLC, and she was heavily foreshadowed in the last level. From Software very clearly wanted these two characters to stand out and be highlights of the DLC that everyone would remember. It's kind of funny that I like Ludwig more than Lady Maria, and I like Baal more than Mesmer. Maybe I am just posing as a From Software fan because I simply do not understand why everyone likes these two the most. Although, I cannot lie, they are both pretty great, and that could be a testament to the quality of the 2 DLCs we are talking about. The nicest thing I can say about Lady Maria is that she's great, an S-tier fight. However, the worst thing I can say about her is that she has a couple of what I will call major issues that I will rattle off at you. Her moveset is an S-tier moveset, but it's hard to utilize this S-tier moveset when it's so easy to abuse what she does. I know, you've all heard this one before. I know, but it's far too easy to whack the lady's face and turn your brain off. It doesn't really take a genius to figure out that she is so easy to stagger, and you can dilute the first half of the fight into a one-sided boxing match where you are a superhero versus an insect. I really wish this wasn't the case, and as much as I hate Millennia, she does not have this issue and she will put up a fight in her first phase. The second issue I take with Lady Maria is that her health is far, far too low. Seriously, this is one of the last bosses in the game with a top tier design put into it, and it's sadly too easy to finish this lady off without any pushback. Since her first phase isn't much of a fight, you will most likely have all or most of your blood vials, removing difficulty, and worst of all with her health, you can attack her while she is doing her phase transition to kill her even faster. Some will say that the criticism that I am applying is unfair because the player can decide the difficulty. And to that I say, no, I don't want to do that. On repeat playthroughs, this is a valid strategy to decide your own fun, but when I first did this boss close to 4 years ago, I had these exact same thoughts. My opinions on her have simply not changed as time has passed. For example, my thoughts have drastically changed on Ornstein and Smo. My first kill on them was me summoning because I was so bad at fighting them. At the time I couldn't do it and I thought that gank fights were stupid and unfair. And if you've been following along with these bosses, you would know that gank fights are literally my favorite shit in the game. It's gotten to the point where I think I'm crazy because I don't hear anyone else talking about real duo fights that aren't Godskin duo. I'm talking the Anor Londo Double Dippers, Ring City, Dark Lurkers, those are all S-tier fights. I digress and I'm getting off topic, so what I was saying is that I don't want to handicap myself on my first playthrough because you never know what you're walking into. Lady Maria very well could have been the hardest boss and I wouldn't have known any better. Bale is a really good example of this because he was so hard for me and it took me a little while to kill him, and he has a great moveset on top of that. He's awesome. And no matter what I do, I can't have that same experience with Lady Maria. I'll drop the point and say that I blame Chalice Dungeons because when I did this DLC for the very first time, I did the old hunters as my last bits of content and went into this DLC role-playing as Big Boy Kratos and not a hunter. So I guess I could push all of my criticism that I have with Bloodborne back into Chalice Dungeons because I've been doing that for 4 years at this point anyway, and for the whole section of this video. Anyway, with all of those criticisms out of the way, the rest of her is fucking awesome. Her music is some of the best From Software has ever produced, and it continues what I love and it adds onto the epic fight, with a loud and apparent original soundtrack that really gets your blood pumping. Hunter fights are usually some of the highlights with Bloodborne, so having balls to the wall, epic ass music here makes the fight oh so much better. The last thing that I want to mention with her mechanics is how From Software made it harder to parry her when she starts pumping that blood and gets out of her first phase. Since she has blood embedded within her weapons, blood will be an after trail when she is attacking, making it so her parry window is just a little bit more tight and you will occasionally get that perfect parry, but you will not get the optimal punish because you did it too late or you were not properly positioned. I love that. I'll talk about it even more with Gherman, but parrying in the base game was a step back from Dark Souls if you ask me. I know that I spewed a lot into your ears, but I do think she is an S-tier boss. I just think that she could have been the very best in the old Hunters with some simple tweaks. What makes Orphan of Kos so special to me is that I think he is the epitome of Bloodborne's tense and deep combat while being one of the hardest bosses in the game. The Orphan is fast and relentless, and he forces you to understand the game to a master tier level in order to beat him. He is the hardest boss in the game that's not a bullshit Chalice Dungeon boss, and with him being at the big finale to Bloodborne, he's well suited to be the final of the big three. The two other bosses in this DLC have been hard in their own right, but have also given the player a lot of leverage to make the fight easier. Ludwig really comes online during phase 2, Lady Maria is practically AFK if you have an R1 button on full blast, but the Orphan doesn't give the player much room to breathe as he is one of the most aggressive bosses in Bloodborne. He doesn't really have many attacks that just graze your health bar as it's something minor that you can shrug off. He hits really hard, and this footage you're seeing is after I've done Chalice Dungeons and pumped my health. Whenever I fight him normally, and by normally I mean not condemning myself to the horror that are Chalice Dungeons, he always kills me a few times. His overall aggression and high damage is where parrying becomes the real threat in Bloodborne. At least for me, his attacks are not animated in a way that feel predictable, and that's a good thing. I always miss the parry window because of how he is animated and moves. It's a part of his character, and FromSoft made that a deliberate design choice that I enjoy. Since he is so aggressive and hard-hitting, missing these parries is where the danger comes into play, as the game's difficulty does peak here. I wish the main game had this more, as parrying in the main game was too easy, and I saved that conversation for Gherman. Very similar to Ludwig, why I love the Orphan is he's just so intriguing and interesting to look at. I couldn't really describe this boss to someone in an eloquent manner or paint an articulate picture for them to understand what he really is. What would I even say? He's a humanoid that wields a placenta? That's just so bad on my end because his design is just so genius. But I could describe most of Elden Ring's bosses quite well because they're in the dark fantasy style that I've sadly grown a bit bored of. This is why Bloodborne has always been one of my more favorite From Software games, because it's just so fucking rad to look at. His fight is definitely the peak of Bloodborne's combat for me, and I have to say, that's a bit saddening. It's saddening because Sony was too stupid to see that From Software and Miyazaki are geniuses and they never greenlit a Bloodborne 2. I remember in my Souls Games Ranked video I said that Sony was too stupid to see From Software's genius and didn't buy them. I worded that poorly because I got a few comments saying that me wanting games to be locked onto a console is wrong, and I agree. I did not mean that I want Sony's console to gatekeep other people from enjoying From Software's art. I literally meant that Sony was too stupid to see the genius of From Software. They missed the mark 3 times and I find it quite hilarious. And I think that's it for me. The last few things I'll say is this. 1, I appreciate how this boss arena isn't a square or rectangle. Boss rooms like this always add character and style to the overall boss. And 2, when he summons the lightning in his second phase, I usually get chills up my back for how eerie it actually sounds. Here, have a listen. Well, we're at the end with the Old Hunters, and it doesn't really end that well. I always get a few comments where people ask why I don't like Laurence, or they think that I'm not giving him enough credit, and I never really understand why. I'm glad these people enjoy the fights, but I almost get nothing out of it. While the music is some of Bloodborne's best, mechanically there's not much here. It is an updated Cleric Beast where the first phase doesn't change much outside of some fire-based attacks. While I do think Cleric Beast is a good introduction to Bloodborne, he's not something I wanted to do again in a DLC. His second phase does undeniably change, so there are some things to talk about there. He does an okay enough job at making you play defensively and become weary of your surroundings, similar to Quelaag, but it's kind of an awkward fight if you ask me. He does a lot of arm slaps and lava spit, and I mainly just watch him struggle. Because of the reuse in the awkward second phase, I would have to rank him on the lower end of Bloodborne as a whole. He's still better than most Chalice dungeon bosses, but that's really not much of a compliment, now is it? I do have to say that the final boss in Bloodborne is still one of From Software's strongest bosses, Gherman. Now, technically that is incorrect, as Mergo can be the final boss or the Moon Presence, but I still think he's the intended final boss, and at worst, Moon Presence is an add-on since that thing is pretty easy. But let's talk about that a little bit more. If we can at least come to some solid grounds and agree that Gherman is Bloodborne's final boss, then I would say he's one of their stronger finales. I do think he's a better finale than any of the games prior to Bloodborne, and better than Dark Souls 3 and even Elden Ring. The only boss that I would say is better is Sekiro, of course. That, to me at least, speaks loudly to Bloodborne's overall quality. This game is without a doubt a masterpiece that should never be lost to time. What I do want to start with is that I think From Software is oddly enough at their best when the final boss arena has flowers or some sort of greenery that is on the playing field. Bloodborne has these pretty white flowers that are surrounding the boss arena, and Sekiro has Chinese silver grass. I do know that it's such an odd thing to point out, but I do like it a lot. I would have liked it even more if the flowers turned red because of the blood that is being spilled in a game that is surrounded with themes and blood itself, but I've lived without it for 9 years, so I'll have to continue living without it. I did save this topic for our last fight, and I sprinkled this idea throughout the video, but Bloodborne's biggest step in the wrong direction, for me at least, was how parries were handled. It's been over a year since I last fought Gherman, and the footage you are seeing here is my first time stepping foot in his boss arena on this character. As you can see, he is an easy parry. I can parry him at a long range, and it can really dilute the boss into a game of parry. Bullets should have been halved in this game for weapons that focus on parrying, and potentially even take away the health drain for bullets. I know it's extreme, and I also know these suggestions will not be heard because FromSoft won't do anything else with this combat system again. But outside of him being an easy parry, he's fucking awesome. He's the last hurrah to the base game, and it's yet another hunter fight, and that's usually when Bloodborne is at its peak. He's fast, and sadly he does suffer from the Lady Maria syndrome where you can just spam him and treat him as an R1 bot. He's not as bad as Lady Maria, but I still don't like the inclusion of this R1 stagger. There is still a lot of great presentation with Gherman, and it's these tiny things that can take a boss from A tier to S tier. How he looks at the moon when he powers up, his grunts when he's fighting, and a lot more that I can list off. All of these little things that he has uplifts this boss to an S tier fight, and it even makes a pleb such as myself engage with the story. As far as I know, you and Gherman are fighting each other because you refuse to let him kill you, which is him giving you mercy so you can leave the Hunter's Nightmare. I'm not a lore guy, and this will be the only time I mention this, but it seems like you guys are trying to kill each other because both of you care deeply for the other person. If that's not some excellent storytelling, then I have no idea what is. Moon Presence is the perfected version of a lore boss as the real finale while still being interesting at the same time. I tried not to criticize King Allant in Demon Souls because it was From Software's first attempt at this style of game, and old King Allant came right before him as the real final boss. Moon Presence is a far more interesting model to look at and has some mechanics to engage with, although at its core this is a story boss. It does have one of the more interesting looks in Bloodborne, and I love the black and red colors. Some may say that his HP and damage are so low that he's unfinished, but I see him as an addition to the game more than anything. And after all of that, I must say Bloodborne bosses do hold up in almost every way. The base game offers a good variety of interesting bosses, some gimmick bosses, with just a few flat out bad bosses such as Witches of Hemwick. If Chalice dungeons were picked up and removed from the game at this very moment, it would be my favorite From Software game. This is one of my favorite From Software games to play as I can easily pick up a new weapon and roleplay as a hunter. I go out, I kill a few beasts, it's for my own good, it's just what hunters do.